How do you know what you know? What systems and structures were in place when you came to know what you know? What systems and structures reinforce your feeling that you do, in fact, know things? What do you know about them? I guess what I'm saying is, do you really know if you know what you know? Oh, I don't know. Welcome to Digesting Food Studies, the podcast that is starting to learn that it might be time to start unlearning stuff, while still remaining dedicated to that holistic and pluralistic field called food studies. I'm your lost and somewhat stumbling host, David Santo. This episode focuses on the importance of unlearning certain ways of knowing and doing, particularly those that are attached to the colonialist structures of academia. Despite the fact that, well, facts are being contested when they are ever more needed, and of course ever more needed to be verified, there's also a need to re-understand how we understand things. Sorry, that's a lot of word salad. Anyway, stay tuned, because the article in focus this episode is an important example of learning to learn and unlearn and relearn, and it comes from Volume 11, Issue 2 of Canadian Food Studies, published in August 2024. Kicking things off, Alexia Moyer shares an unrecipe for making eulachon grease, a lesson less about making the substance in question and more about who gets to make and represent knowledge. It's an Amuse Bouche for the mind, perhaps more than the mouth. I then chat with Ronak and Alissa Overend about what happened in the lead-up to writing their reflective article about unlearning, and how they now feel about urban berry foraging. And wrapping things up, artist and now former master's student Annika Walsh tells us how Ronak's and Alissa's writing both inspires her and reveals much about her own relationships. Well, hi, Alexia. Today, we're going to unlearn about things, which is a slightly complicated concept when it comes to academic work, because we're always busy running around trying to learn stuff. But as we'll hear in the conversation with our authors later on, unlearning, and in fact, sometimes not learning about certain kinds of knowledge is important, as we're going to hear from you.
And to help us through this concept, our cultural object of the day is a little fish called the eulachon.
A fish? Not a goldfish that forgets things, but an eulachon that teaches us to remember or not know?
It's a fish that comes from the smelt family,
okay.
And it teaches us that we do not get to learn everything. Now, these particular fish are found in the northwestern coastal waters of North America. They are about the size of your hand. They've also been called the candlefish because they contain so much oil that if you dry them and you stick them on a stick, you can burn them as a candle.
Oh, fascinating. So a bit like a candle nut.
Yeah. So I wanted to share a description of how to prepare them. And this description appears in Eden Robinson's novel Monkey Beach. And it's set in Kitimat Village, a community of the Haida people, and is relayed by narrator Lisa Marie Hill. Because of their high oil content, eulachons go rancid easily and don't last in the fridge or freezer. If you want to taste the eulachon year-round, you have to make them into grease. To do this, you have to catch a suitable number of fat, juicy eulachons. Then the fish must be aged properly for 1 to 2 weeks in a large pit. 2 things must be kept in mind when aging the fish. First, the longer the fish is aged, the stronger the taste of the grease. And secondly, weather conditions affect the ripening process. Only the most experienced grease makers should decide when the eulachons are ripe enough to be transformed into grease. Now, a description of how to separate the oil from the fish follows, as well as a description of its culinary and its medicinal uses. But what I want to get at in this little paragraph is what's missing from that paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
So we learned that the fish has to be aged properly, but we don't know how.
Or in what other substances, perhaps.
And for how long.
Yeah.
We learned that weather conditions appear to affect the aging process, but what these conditions are and how they potentially speed up or slow down the process are factors left open to interpretation.
Or left open to those who hold the knowledge, but maybe don't want to share the knowledge?
Exactly. So the task of deciding when to make the grease the narrator one should be left to experienced persons. So it's that experienced persons who hold the knowledge and do not have to share all of it, or depending on the context, will share some of it. On the one hand, we could say that what we're facing here are the limits of the written recipe. So Robinson is engaged in translating the gestures and the taste of such favored foods into written words as one, but not the only means of preserving them. But as with any translation, a space opens up between the gestures and the words, between the slender swimming eulachon in situ and the jar of grease on one's kitchen counter. So Adam Gopnik describes the space as the reality of cooking from a book. He writes, the recipe is a blueprint, but it's also a red herring. A way to do something and a false summing up of a living process that can be handed on only by experience, a knack posing as a knowledge.
Yeah, well, it's embodied knowledge that wraps itself around a script. In my language, I would call it a script and a performance. And one is codependent with the other, but it was not pure truth on the page, nor pure truth in the enactment.
Right. So cookbooks are sometimes this poor substitute for this day-to-day doing, that face-to-face transmission of the kind that the narrator Lisa Marie has with her grandmother. Now, such elisions are not only in keeping with the realities of cooking from books, but they are also, and this is what I want to stress, and this is what it connects to our interview later on, they are also part of a deliberate practice on Robinson's part. So she is placing limits on what knowledge is shared, or on the context in which the knowledge is shared. So certain aspects of Hyla life are off limits. Now, as Robinson has stated, she just can't write about certain things. So writing about Monkey Beach, Kit Dobson provides one answer, arguing as he does that Robinson puts an important limit on the novel's potential function as a sociological or ethnographic document. It's not a straightforward representation of Hyla life for easy consumption. More broadly speaking, I'd like to bring in another text by Gregory Younging and his Elements of Indigenous Style, a guide to writing by and about Indigenous peoples. It's a helpful and it's a necessary guide to the protocols for the use and transmission of collective knowledge. Note the use of the word protocols and not customs. He insists on the formality and the legality of the word protocols. And he writes, artistic aspects of traditional knowledge such as songs, dances, stories, dramatic performances, and herbal and medicinal techniques can only be shared in certain settings or spiritual ceremonies with individuals who have earned, inherited, and or gone through a cultural and or educational process.
Yeah, there's a training that I've gone through called OCAP, which is about protecting Indigenous knowledge when you're participating in Indigenous contexts. And it's also about not being extractive, about not taking knowledge that doesn't belong to you, about not using knowledge at the wrong season, about ensuring control and management of knowledge by the people who own that knowledge or who have created that knowledge. And this is starting to resonate really strongly with me.
Yeah, we're really thinking about setting limits on the forms of knowledge and respecting those limits. And eulachon or eulachon becomes a way of understanding that.
Well, thank you for this. And I think it's, as an open access journal, we often think all knowledge should be shared openly, and yet not all knowledge should be. And I think the eulachon helps us recognize that. And thanks to you for highlighting that and giving us an object lesson in what can be known and what cannot be known sometimes.
Thanks, David.
Alissa Overend is an associate professor at MacEwan University in Edmonton, learning and teaching about food and nutrition, health and illness, critical disability studies, and intersectional inequality. They are the host of the Alternative Food Network's podcast, The Ground Up, and author of the 2021 book, Shifting Food Facts, which examines the so-called food truths of contemporary dietary discourse. Ronak is a PhD student at the University of Alberta, having completed a master's degree that identified challenges and opportunities that first-generation immigrant therapists face in the context of working with Indigenous clients. Ronak and Alissa met while Ronak was an undergraduate student at MacEwan. Well, Ronak and Alissa, thank you both so much for being here on Digesting Food Studies. I am more than delighted to be talking to you about your wonderful article, Learning and Unlearning. And it's a real pleasure to just see you both.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, David.
So this piece, it's an extraordinary exploration and analysis and reflection. It's about many, many things. But I'd love to know from your perspective what it was when you were writing it, what you planned to do in terms of addressing different themes within research and where you think you got.
I could start us off there. The project sort of emerged largely from a desire to do more with Indigenous teachings on food. I had come out of a probably 2 to 3 year long book project and was really fascinated, inspired, buoyed by Indigenous food teachings. And so it came at it from a kind of epistemological stance of like, what can I know more about Indigenous ways of knowing and understanding food? So at the time, I reached out to our Indigenous Learning Center on campus and said, hey, you have interest in food, I have interest in food. We had a conversation and we came to the idea of learning about exploring teachings of berries. So Edmonton has a large river valley system in the city, and it does hold a lot of edibles, including Saskatoon berries. So it sort of merged from that to a kind of naive or maybe innocent exploration of berries. And it moved into something quite different.
And Ronak, when Alissa first said, hey, let's do this project together, what did you first think?
Yeah, to be very honest with you, I was in my late undergrad years, so I was preparing for very competitive graduate school applications, and my intention was, let me diversify my research experience, and so that's why I reached out to Alissa, and I was kind of looking for anything. There was no particular specific interest. I didn't know about Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous food systems, everything that we learned, so my intention was to actually gain research experience in kind of whatever form Alissa had available if she did. And it was a lot more profound and went in a different direction than I ever could have anticipated.
Yeah. So another innocent approach to the work. But then as you dived into the challenges, as you describe in the article, well, first of all, neither of you identifies as Indigenous, correct?
Yes.
Correct.
So here you are as non-Indigenous people working with Indigenous people on Indigenous food systems themes. And that itself is something that is complicated. It's something that a lot of us in food studies struggle with because there are these deep and important learnings. There's a lot of really interesting knowledge to be had. There's some knowledges that shouldn't be shared with the academy, as you point out. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's where Indigenous, non-Indigenous research collaborations get sticky.
100%. And I know, just speaking about using my tenured position of privilege in ways that benefit people historically excluded from the academy, we had a small grant to do a couple of community events and to pay honoraria for the interviews. So that felt like an important piece of sort of, breaking down some of those walls that academia has long built. But there's another thing that's happening, and I think that's what a lot of the article speaks to, is you're really operating at this chasm or this disjunct between the norms and practices of academia, which want very legible, tangible outcomes. They have deadlines. There's all these sort of checklists. And what we found is that a lot of the Indigenous teachings, they don't fit into that rubric. They don't map onto it. It's slow, very slow learning, particularly in the summer months, which is when we were doing this work. And as many of us know, a lot of Indigenous elders and communities are being overtaxed and overasked to do a lot of these things. And I think there was some justifiable hesitation around two settlers from within the academy doing this. I don't know if any of that was conscious, but I think what we walked are these two very different paradigms around university norms and practices and the relational, slow norms and practices of Indigenous teachings.
Universities and university members, scholars and researchers are gradually learning to undo some of those, or unlearn, as you put it, some of those historic practices that were about extracting knowledge from communities. The old anthropologists who went away and then took knowledge and then wrote about it and didn't do any benefit for the community. And that's really a problematic paradigm in universities, which is very much in line with colonialism and capitalism and extractivism in general. Ronak, was this also part of your consciousness as you were walking into this, or was this just relatively invisible as a late undergraduate student?
This was probably at the forefront because I was very aware that I am a settler on Indigenous land, and there's a lot of nervousness and even fear about stepping into this work, and especially your role in this work. And I talk about in the article the difference between Indigenous research and research that I'm used to reading, which is Western research. These concepts of positionality, reflexivity are often lacking. It's very to the point. It's very not what I'm used to. So when you're stepping into this work, there's a lot of reflective work that you have to do for yourself. I hadn't thought about these things as much before. I hadn't thought about my identity as a settler on Indigenous land, or even thinking about the fears that I felt. I felt nervousness. I felt a little confused, but I wasn't sure why. And it's only through that work and stepping into it that these things became more apparent. And so I'm grateful to that work because now I also know myself more.
I wanted to add something quickly to Ronak's last statement around the unknowing and the vagueness, because I think when we start research projects, we don't actually know. And so we might have to write a proposal that gets us to talk about that we do know what we're doing. But I think some of the best research is the research that develops as we're in it. Mm-hmm. And I think that those are the values of qualitative research. And as our institutions move more towards these quantified metrics, I think there's definitely some value in holding on to the unknown. And I think that was a large lesson for me that came out of the work.
Also, I'm really interested in how research transforms the researcher, that by doing processes of research and then reflecting on them, presumably, and maybe getting pushback or critique about them, we learn to be different. And that seems to be what you've just expressed. Ronak, you're now finishing up a master's degree and going on to a PhD. And so I'm really curious how this work or other work that you did in your early years as a scholar have continued to transform you or make you think differently or act differently.
Yeah, in so many ways. If I hadn't done this independent study, I wouldn't be where I am now because I'm working with an Indigenous professor. And how would I have reached out to her if I hadn't had those gears turning about, hey, I'm actually interested in this research. This is a whole new world to me and it's so fascinating. And I honestly, sad to say, I didn't even know it existed. Mm-hmm. And my master's thesis focuses on identifying challenges and opportunities that first generation immigrant therapists face in the context of working with Indigenous clients. So it has led me to a place that I feel passionate about. And basically, it has affected me not just in the academic world, but also at a deeply personal level, I would say as well.
That's fantastic because, again, my work is often sort of transdisciplinary or relational. I take a lot from queer theory and feminist studies. And as I've gotten to know more about Indigenous ways of knowing, I start thinking, oh, okay, there's alignment there. And yet I'm not Indigenous and I don't feel the right to speak about that category of doing and thinking. And yet there's alignments, there are parallels, there are connections that I can make, and I can get better at being a food studies person by following those paths. And yet there's so many tensions and so many ways to get it wrong. But it sounds like you're very much getting it right. And so, Alissa, I'll turn the same question back to you. What are you thinking now about change in your perspective and how research is done and what this experience of this research project and writing has brought to you?
For me, the change wasn't a change in thinking. I think researching on Indigenous histories and settler histories and colonial histories is all important, but one can't know the work entirely without actually experiencing it. So whether it be the importance of land-based teachings, which is obviously connected to the work that we do in food studies, I think that for me is the shift. And so this sort of classification or categorical thinking of settler, Indigenous, colonial, all of those things do matter. But I think if you take a few steps back in the grand scheme of food systems right now and justice movements, there is this sense that, we are all tethered together. And so the rights and justices of other peoples, particularly marginalized peoples, are always going to be connected to our own. And I think for me, I have shifted a lot of these teachings and work into alternative food networks. So again, land-based teachings that bring us into relationality with larger food systems, communities, the land, and those types of things.
So my last question for both of you, as you write in the article, the berries that you were, in air quotes, researching ceased to be the subject of your research and became in many ways, as you say, your teacher. And I'd love to know, as this is now a couple of years ago, what's going on with your relationship to Saskatoon berries now? When you see one, what do they say to you these days?
The way I used to look at berries is, okay, food, that's cool. what else, right? So very taken for granted kind of approach, not just berries, I think all food. And that's changed since the independent study. That's changed since I've learned more about Indigenous culture and how much they value food. And in the article, like Alissa talks about how berries are teachings rather than just objects of study. And that has stuck with me a lot. So now if I think about berries, I think about that time when we went on those walks in the river valley. And it's such a pleasant memory. My mother was there and it felt like a reconnection to my mother. And that might sound like such a stretch, but it's true. That walk and those memories have reminded me and reconnected me to values that I actually had in Kashmir when I was a young child and became so distant from when we moved here. So berries are a reminder of all these values that kind of awoke in me when we were doing this study. And they're much more than just sustenance to me now, for sure.
That's fantastic. Alissa, how are you feeling about berries these days?
Ronak might have said it better than I will, but as anecdotes, as Ronak alludes to the ways in which we consume, produce, purchase food, I think grocery stores are emblematic to me of that fast-paced life. People don't make eye contact in grocery stores. You may not even, talk to another human if you go through one of the automatic checkouts. The food, there's no relationality to it. It's literally sealed off. It's really hard to know where these things come from, the hands that they have transgressed to get to our plates and to our grocery carts. So for me, berries and berry picking and foraging, it's an opportunity to just live differently, even if it's short-lived, even if it's a couple hours or a half day. The berries do seem sacred, and I don't use that term, hopefully not in an extractivist sense, but they're precious. Maybe that's a better term. They take a lot of time to get, and there is that connection to the land, to the community when you do go out and have that conversation and that time with them. So even when I'm not actually picking berries, I know where some of the bushes that I found are. So I do give them a little nod and a hello and that type of thing. And I do think there is a very nice escape maybe, or just way of living differently in thinking about, even if it's a 2-hour outing.
Well, thank you. I know even when I'm buying strawberries from Ile-de-Rien in Quebec, I look at them differently now because I've read your articles. So I thank you both for that. And I thank you both very much for coming on the podcast.
Happy to hear that, David. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Annika Walsh is an artist and researcher who centers food and cooking in her transdisciplinary work. She recently completed a Master's of Science in Integrated Studies in Land and Food Systems at the University of British Columbia, working with the wonderful Tabitha Robin. In addition to her many accomplishments in food and art, she contributed several works to the open access textbook, Food Studies, Matter, Meaning, Movement.
Hey, my name is Annika Walsh. I'm an artist and a grad student at the University of British Columbia. I'm currently finishing up a Master's of Science in Integrated Studies in Land and Food Systems. My research focuses on the relationships between cultural foods and identity, specifically how Chinese-Canadian adoptees, like myself, relate to food in ways that are often complex, emotional, and constantly shifting. So there are 3 main things that I really particularly enjoyed within this article. The first is how they talked about lived experiences as something to center and to be informed by, not just as background information or in a positionality statement, but as something that actually shapes and informs the way their research is done. Dr. Alissa Overend and Ronak both do this so genuinely within this piece. It really, really hit home for me. So much of my work is tangled up in personal questions like, what does it mean to feel disconnected from your so-called heritage food? Or how authentic can my homemade dumpling recipe be when all my grandma passed down to me was her signature meatloaf recipe? Which is still a killer dish on its own, but it's not necessarily what you think to be traditional dumpling recipes. Secondly, I also really appreciated how the article holds that tension of wondering whether academia is even the right place for certain ways of knowing. A lot of us still choose to stay, choosing to work within these structures while dreaming of something better. That balancing act feels very, very real to me. And, I question it all the time, but I'm also not ready to give up on it. And then there's the reminder to decenter ourselves within research projects. Dr. Alissa Overend definitely went through this process, And I felt like they told the story of this journey really, really well within this article. I was right there tagging along with them. Something I also want to touch on is the respect that Dr. Alissa Overend and Ronak have with each other. This reminds me of my own relationship with my supervisor, Dr. Tabitha Robin, a Indigenous food sovereignty researcher. We both have very different backgrounds. We come from different places, different families, different ways of being. Yet something we both prioritize is understanding and respecting our ways of knowing. We deeply, deeply learn from each other. And actually, we have found out that we practice a lot of the same things, but just call them different things. This is something that Tabitha and I talk about a lot, is not treating our participants like data, but like real people that have agency and stories that exist beyond our projects. Dr. Alissa Overend and Ronak Ray went through that same understanding and wanting to practice that same level of reciprocity and respect in reference to specifically berries for them. That level of reciprocity and relationship building is something that I am really trying to hold on to, especially since my work involves a community I am personally connected to. It's a different kind of responsibility. For other readers of this article, I think the biggest takeaway for me was to stay curious, to question everything, and certainly to not be afraid of being wrong. You'll come to know that both Dr. Alissa Overend and Ronak Ray were challenged in the best way possible, and the project didn't necessarily turn out the way they had planned from the start, but it turned into something way, way better. And that is something I'm taking away for myself, for my own research, is to remember that this process is iterative and you are constantly learning from places and people that you might not have expected. That is the best part of research, is being wrong. Challenging your own expectations and assumptions. Yeah.
I once wrote a paper about food, performance, and knowing called Eater Eaten, What Revolves Around Who? It was an attempt to muddle through what I, at the time, wondered about the intersubjectivities of food and humans. Today, I think I'd have been better off using the word relationships or maybe reciprocities. The aim of the piece was, I think, to decentralize people, societies, institutions, states from our food systems, and to see food itself as agential and gravitational, just as centered as we've made humanity. Of course, I forgot to interview food, or better, to listen to what food had to say, and then make sure that what I wrote served food and food systems rather than me and my own career. Alas, the piece remains PDF'd in the ether now, and I can't undo what I wrote. So I live and I unlearn. For keeping food studies stuff altogether uncertain, I offer my big thanks to Alexia Moyer, Ronak Rai, Alissa Overend, and Annika Walsh. Our mostly all-knowing executive producers are Rachel Engler-Stringer, Laurence Godin, Charles Levko, Phil Loring, and Kristen Lowett. I'm the moderately clueless David Santo. The show notes include links mentioned in this episode and provide you with a great occasion to like, subscribe, and comment on the show, or to read the names of the producers of our music, Alex Guz and Evgeny Barduzha. In the somewhat silly opener to this episode, I riffed a little too long on the idea of knowing and knowing how we know. Clearly, our systems of knowledge-making have evolved and mutated and even been perverted over the millennia that humans have been learning, unlearning, relearning, and sometimes forgetting. While we're in a given framework of understanding, though, it can be awfully hard to see its borders and boundaries, and to really, truly get how they shape our knowledges. If only we could step back from the frames of reference and take a relativist perspective on things. But then, of course, not being certain is a pretty great space to spend time in.